Morning, United States of America and world. This is Steve Rao, one of the new hosts of a new show that we're starting called American Politics. Today, it's a special edition. We have a lot going on in this country. All eyes are on the United States of America as we're 24 hours away from a presidential election, as Vice President Kamala Harris is against Donald J. Trump, the former president, to see who will be the 47th president of these United States of America. There's been talk about polls, swing states, and let's not forget it's the path to 270, 270 electoral votes. If all Democrats held the maps, it would be 44 votes to get Kamala Harris to 270. She would have 226 going in. Donald J. Trump, 219 electoral votes. He needs 51. So, what is the path to 270? How do we feel about it? And most importantly, today we're going to talk about the economy. And we couldn't think of a better person for me to co host this show than David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General for the United States of America under President Bill Clinton and the 43rd President George Bush, Bush II. And he also has written a book called America 2040, Are We Still a Superpower? I've been here for a very long time reading off his resume, but it's honored to bring him in now with me as we together for the next hour have a candid and honest discussion about the future of our country, the future of the presidency, and what's at stake. David, my friend, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Steve. I'll be glad when this race is over. Believe me, I'm tired of it.
I know we're all so tired. I'm looking for that second wind of boost to get through the night. I'm going to be at the polls tomorrow. I'm here in the radio station at WPTF. We're going to be doing some radio, and we got Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor, coming in at 3:20. But let's start with. I didn't have time to really prepare today, but this is going to be kind of a work in progress. But let's start with where we are today, 24 hours going in. So I've heard, the path to 270, different combinations of how to get there, whether she could win the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, or are the polls just completely off? And, are we just going to be in for, another Trump victory? Walk me through kind of like how you see this playing out the next few hours as we get to the final day here.
Well, there are three big things that are up tomorrow. Number one is obviously the presidential race. Number two is the Senate. And number three is the House. Let's start with the presidential race. On the presidential race, I think you have to look at a number of things. You have to look at where do things stand right now on the popular vote. How does that translate into electoral votes? But also, where do things stand now on the popular vote as it relates to how things were 4 years ago and 8 years ago? And when you do that, if you look at the Real Clear Politics latest average, shockingly to me, Trump actually is about 0.3 points ahead of Harris on the national popular vote. That's hard for me to believe. I don't believe it'll end up that way. But if you compare where he is as compared to where he was 4 years ago and where he was 8 years ago, he's much better positioned now than he was 4 years ago and 8 years ago as compared to where Biden and Clinton were, because they were both ahead by different amounts. And now Trump allegedly is ahead by 0.3%. When you look at the 530, when you look at the electoral votes, there's at least four organizations that have already come up with their final projection. And frankly, I think it's too close to call. Atlas, who was the best last time, Rasmussen, RCP, Real Clear Politics, which is an aggregation, and 538, which is an aggregation. And they've all predicted Trump by anywhere from, a little over 270 votes up to, a little over 300 votes. The truth is we don't know. And the truth is that we may not know tomorrow night because there are some states, and it's my understanding, including Pennsylvania, which in my opinion is probably the most important state tomorrow. They don't even start counting their early ballots until the day of the election. And we've had record, early ballots in a bunch of states, including your state. I thought I saw something this morning that North Carolina, that over 54% of registered voters have already voted in North Carolina, which is way more than it's ever been the case in the past. So we'll see. So let's start with the presidential race, and at some point, let's talk a little bit about the Senate and the House, because in the final analysis, all three of them are important in determining where do we go from here.
Okay, so let's start with the presidential. I think I was on a debate a few days ago where the argument was, okay, is the economy better now than it was 4 years ago? So if you look at the data, more jobs have been created, 15 million new jobs, unemployment at 3.5%. Trump left the White House with 3 million fewer jobs than when he came in with, and unemployment was 6.5%. Now, COVID was a big result of that. Inflation is down, but still prices are high. Housing prices are high. So what do you assess? Do you think undecideds are going to think the economy is better now, or do you think they're going to be voting what they're seeing at their wallets with groceries and gas price? Well, gas prices aren't so bad anymore, but who has a better argument for the economy, and how do you think that's swinging for either candidate?
Well, what I can tell you what I think about what the facts are with regard to the economy, and part of it has to do with contextual sophistication. Let's talk about unemployment. I think unemployment now is about 4%.
Yeah.
Unemployment was 3.5% before COVID. And let's talk about the issue of GDP growth. GDP growth is about 2.4%, which is modest, but that's driven primarily by $2 trillion in spending in excess of revenues. And if you look at the employment numbers, the only part of the economy that's really growing is government, and government is not the engine of innovation and productivity in the United States. And if you look at inflation, rate increase is down significantly, which is good, but accumulated inflation during this administration is over 20%, and in some cases, depending upon which category you talk about, much higher than that. So, irrespective of what I think. Oh, by the way, you talk about GDP. We don't have the best GDP growth in the world. Russia's better than us. China's better than us. Iran's better than us. India is better than us. Ukraine's better than us, and they're at war. Okay, so the problem I have with a lot of politicians and a lot of talking heads is they'll cherry pick the numbers, and they don't want to end up providing contextual sophistication. You don't know how good or bad you have it unless you compare it to your competitor, and unless you compare it to your other countries, if you will. So. What doesn't matter? It doesn't matter what I think or what you think. It matters what the American people think, and the American people, rightly or wrongly, believe that they are not better off today than they were 4 years ago. I think the latest number I saw is 47% of Americans believe they're worse off today than they were 4 years ago, and only about 21% believe they're better off, and the others just didn't really have an opinion. So it's about 2 to 1 people believing they're worse off than they were 4 years ago. And of course, the real question is, what are things going to be like going forward? I mean, what's the future going to be like? No matter what happens on the election tomorrow, president, tens of millions of Americans are going to be very upset.
Oh yeah, so from the economy, and we're going to talk about at the end of the show about how divided we become. And I know you were also a member of the No Labels Party, along with Senator soon to be former U.S. Senator Joe Manchin. I from my home state of West Virginia. So listen, from the economy perspective, your analysis is that it's really leaning more towards Trump in terms of just if the decision is, are you better off 4 years ago? Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Looks like those undecideds might be leaning towards no, we're not, which means they're going to cast a vote for Trump or stay at home, which helps Trump.
If that's their issue, right? I mean, let's talk about what the biggest issues seem to be.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah.
And by the way, Steve, I don't think there are very many undecided voters. I think less than 5% of the voting population is undecided. I mean, these are two very, very different choices. Okay. There are pros and cons to each of them, but they're just fundamentally different people in so many different ways. But the biggest issues seem to be, based on the polling that I've seen, are the economy, and there's lots of dimensions to the economy, one of which is inflation, but it's not the only dimension. Okay. But real wage growth, that's an issue. Okay. Unemployment's obviously an issue. Those are the ones that individuals can relate to. They don't relate as much to like GDP, growth and things of that nature. There are other issues that come in that they don't really relate to, like the savings rate, the debt, the debt, the border and immigration.
Yeah.
The top issue. Crime is a top issue. International stability is a top issue. Reproductive rights and abortion is a top issue. Protecting democracy is an issue, but not nearly as big as it was at the beginning of the campaign. So I think that the top four issues are the economy, border security and immigration, crime, abortion, reproductive rights, and if I had to add a fifth one, it would be international stability. And that's what I think people are most concerned about.
Okay, so it looks like the board. So reproductive rights is the issue she's strongest on.
Absolutely.
So that may be leaning in her favor when we see the returns come in tomorrow. If more women in these urban and suburban areas, perhaps even Republican women, coming out and silently voting for Harris, that could potentially help her in some of these swing states: the blue wall, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina. Although North Carolina does look like it's still leaning a little bit more Trump. Keep in mind that 42% North Carolina is in the urban areas, but the rest is in the rural areas. So it's very difficult to assess. It's basically two states within one, which is why we've got Democratic governor, Republican lieutenant governor, Democratic governor, Republican legislature, supermajority in the legislature, General Assembly. So I guess that's fair to say. We put it in terms of border. How do you see that playing out? Is that driving more pro-Trump people that do not want 1 million illegal immigrants here, deportees?
I think you're right that Harris wins on the reproductive rights and abortion issue. Okay, I think clearly Trump wins on the border. I don't think it's close. And the reason being is just look at the data. I mean, just look at how many people crossed the border during Trump's administration versus how many people crossed the border during this administration. And it's true that starting about in June, this administration started tightening up somewhat, and the numbers have come down considerably from what they were. But then most Americans say, why didn't you do that 4 years ago? Why did you wait until 4 or 5 months before an election to do that? And the other, in terms of everybody's talking about that piece of legislation, the bipartisan legislation. Well, that bipartisan legislation wasn't introduced until 2024. What happened? I mean, and there was a piece of legislation, that the Republicans offered, HR 1, which was about which passed the House, okay, largely on a partisan vote, but the Senate never even took it up. So, I think Trump wins on the border issue. I think there's a little question about that.
Now, in terms of, I want to spend some time on this one because it is rather confusing. If you're going to deport, he said the first thing he's going to do if elected is deport 1 million illegal immigrants. Right now, there's only 6,000 ICE agents from the federal enforcement agency there. It would take 100,000, probably cost, they're saying, $80 billion. Is it unrealistic to do it all at once? And isn't that, David, going to shut down the economy? Who's going to work in farming? Who's going to work in restaurants, retail?
Well, first, you're not going to do it all at once. It's totally unrealistic to expect you're going to do it all at once. The latest thing that I've heard said was you start with the people that have committed crimes, and he's also said, again, rightly or wrongly, I'm just reporting what's been said. I'm not saying I think it's right or wrong. He's also said that he's going to crack down on sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. There's lots of ways you can do that. You can withhold federal aid to those cities and states that don't cooperate with ICE. So I think, round one would be to eliminate sanctuary city and sanctuary state status, to force people to start cooperating with ICE, and to prioritize people who have either committed crimes and or people who, based upon whatever we've discovered, represent a risk to either our national security and or our domestic tranquility. You're not gonna send back 20 million people. That's not gonna happen. Okay.
But the dreamers, these people that have been extended protections. I mean, I'm already getting phone calls. Many people. There's many from India who's actually they came here with the parents on the H-1B, but they've aged out, so they're what you call documented dreamers. So it's a little bit of a unique situation. But there is a possibility of Trump elected that people scared is that ICE going to show up at their door and families would be separated, which
that's not going to happen. Okay. I mean, by the way, India had 7% GDP growth rate, so they wiped us. All right. So and CEOs of a lot of the top companies in America have Indian heritage, as you know. So
I hope so.
That's not gonna look. My personal view is a deal can be done on immigration. But you have to secure the border first. Okay. I mean, that's a conditioned precedent to be able to get Republican support for an immigration deal. I also believe that the dreamers ought to have a pathway to citizenship. But I also believe that we need to think about differentiating between a pathway to legal status and a pathway to citizenship. They're fundamentally different. Okay. Furthermore, I think we have to differentiate between temporary visas like work permits, okay, and permanent green cards. There's lots of things that can and should be done to solve this problem, but I can tell you this, it ain't going to happen until you get control of the border. That's job one.
Yeah, job one, control the border, could be immigration reform, which might be something Trump wants to do, is to, coming in, if he does get elected, come forward with a bipartisan bill to try to stop the border, however they do it. And then, of course, accelerating the path to citizenship for these green card holders. I mean, if you came in from India today to become a U.S. citizen, it would take 150 years to become a citizen of this country. So there's obviously an issue there. And many of them are leaving to Canada to get jobs, because they don't want to stay in the U.S. forever, right? So this is an issue.
One of the issues, Steve, is that we ought to be basing our immigration law much more on what are the economic needs of our country. There are many countries that already do that. I mean, we clearly have a problem because our birth rate in the United States is 1.62. It's 1.62 per female. It takes 2.1 per female just to maintain your current population. So we would be losing population absent immigration. And the country was built to a great extent on immigration. And so we need immigration. The question is, there's a difference between legal and illegal immigration. We need to be making our immigration policies, yes, for people that are trying to achieve asylum for legitimate reasons, of which, by the way, the DHS says, Department of Homeland Security says, that 85 to 90% of the people who are seeking asylum in the United States do not qualify for asylum in the United States. And so, that's another example where, and the other thing I would say is catch and release is not consistent with current law. And when it takes 5 to 7 years to be able to give somebody their day in court and they don't show up for their day in court, you got a system that just doesn't work.
That's incredible. I mean, well, the border's one. I really appreciate this hour with you, David. We're kind of going issue by issue today. And eventually on the show, we'll be bringing other guests, especially after the election. Let's talk about foreign policy. I think this is an issue that's tough. We're in the middle of war in Ukraine. We're in the middle of the terrible situation in the Middle East. We do have better relations with our NATO allies, Finland and Sweden getting in NATO. The Biden-Harris administration pushing Ukraine to be NATO members. But former President Trump says the day he's elected, within days, Putin will negotiate a deal with Ukraine. things will get better in the Middle East. Who's stronger in foreign policy now, the Democrats or the Republicans?
Well, this is a very complicated issue. Let me just give you a few thoughts, okay?
Yeah,
First, I think the NATO recruiter of the year is not Joe Biden, it's Vladimir Putin.
right.
The fact that Putin invaded Ukraine is what motivated NATO to get together and recognize that they were a lot more at risk than we are due to geographic proximity. The fact that Putin invaded Ukraine caused Finland and Sweden to want to join NATO because of their proximity to the Soviet Union and a history between Finland and Russia, or then the Soviet Union. Countries that are at war cannot join NATO. And so therefore, Ukraine is not eligible to join NATO now, even if it want to join now. Secondly, it has to be unanimous for a country to be able to join NATO from the existing NATO members. There's at least 2 countries that would not support Ukraine joining NATO, and maybe 3. While Putin has said that he doesn't have a problem with Ukraine joining the European Union, with or without the Eurozone, that's a different issue, okay? He's drawn a red line, rightly or wrongly, with them joining NATO, okay? I think where Trump is coming from is, rightly or wrongly, is can Ukraine win this war? How is it going to end? My personal opinion is that people have misanalyzed what Putin was trying to achieve. My personal opinion is Putin wanted to take large parts of eastern Ukraine, and he's taken good parts of it now, all right? He wanted to create a land bridge to Crimea, which did not exist previously. He wanted to topple the government in Kyiv and put in a friendly government, which is what he did in Belarus. He did not want to take over the entire country because he wanted a buffer to NATO. And so by having a friendly government in Kyiv, by leaving everything west of the river to the Ukraine government, and by just taking portions of Ukraine that are Russian oriented, if you will, then he would have achieved his objective. Politically, Putin can't afford to lose. And what my concern is it will he resort to using tactical nuclear weapons if he thinks he's in danger of losing? And so I think the bottom line is I felt since basically the beginning that this is likely to end similar to how Korean Peninsula ended. Is there'll be a negotiated truce. Ukraine, there'll be some agreement on territory. Ukraine won't agree that it's Russia's territory, but they'll stop fighting. I think that's the most likely resolution because just look at the numbers. I mean, Russia has a lot more, human resources, and by the way, their economic growth is better than our economic growth. And our sanctions on Russia have not worked in part because of the alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and others against our interest. Okay. So I think, bottom line is that's Ukraine. If you look today, you've got the Ukrainian conflict going on. You've got the conflict in the Middle East going on. And we've got the potential of a conflict over Taiwan that would happen. And so, I think one of the things that people are very concerned about is who is likely to do a better job in providing international stability. And
What do you think?
And
what do you think?
We'll differ on that.
Keep going, David. I'm putting my headsets on because I had to move. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
David, are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm putting my headsets on. Okay, great. So, I mean, so do you believe then that there's an argument to be made that former President Trump might have a clear argument that not being in Ukraine and that he's stronger in foreign policy. That our foreign policy is that $1 billion we're spending in Ukraine. I believe personally that we need to fight for Ukrainian independence, but there are others that say that we don't need to because we're wasting money from things that could be spent in the U.S. economy.
Look, I believe that we need to support Ukraine, but I believe that we blew it from the beginning. And we blew it from the beginning for several reasons. Number one, the way that we exited Afghanistan was outrageous, and it emboldened our adversaries. Secondly, we blew it as far back as 2014 during the Obama administration. Russia took Crimea, and we did nothing. Thirdly, you can't deter aggression after the fact. You must deter aggression before the aggression occurs. Fourthly, if you recall, President Biden said, asked by the media some time ago, what would you do if Putin invades Ukraine? And his answer was something to the effect of, it depends upon the nature of the incursion, which basically says that, if it's a limited incursion, it might be okay. If it's not a limited incursion, it may not be okay. So the bottom line is, I believe Ukraine has been mishandled for a number of years, going back to 2014, when despite the Budapest Agreement, which we signed along with UK and ironically Russia signed, that guaranteed the territorial independence of Ukraine if they gave up their nuclear weapons. As part of the split up of the Soviet Union, and we didn't do anything in 2014. That was the beginning of where we are today. The question is, how do you end it? How do you end it? And so, yes, I think we need to support Ukraine, but I think we didn't do it the right way. We started too late, and now the question is, how's it going to end?
Okay, so that's a good question. So I think from a foreign policy perspective, how do you think this is going to impact the election results?
I'm surprised that Ukraine hasn't been a bigger issue in the election. Frankly, Israel and Gaza and the situation in the Middle East seems to have been a much bigger issue in this election, especially in some segments of the voting population than Ukraine has. So I don't see that really having a big impact on voters,
Right. It's just kind of now in terms of let's shift in now. So we've talked about foreign policy, we've talked about the economy, we've talked about let's talk about the debt real quick before we shift into the Senate. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because we might require a whole show on that. But $33 trillion of debt, 1.5 federal deficit, $1 trillion deficit. This is an issue that you've been speaking about a lot. How come we're not talking about that right now? Do you see these tax cuts from both candidates? Trump, for the wealthy, Harris for the middle class. Do you see this making the debt worse? Do you think we're not addressing it?
Well, first, the last fiscally responsible president was Bill Clinton. Nobody since Bill Clinton, whether they be a Democrat or Republican, has been fiscally responsible. Neither one of these two presidential candidates are acting in a fiscally responsible manner. Trump's proposals, if fully endorsed, would be worse than Harris's, but both of them would make the situation worse, not better. Both of them are making promises that are fiscally irresponsible and in some cases politically infeasible. They're talking about no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits, no tax on overtime. By the way, that doesn't help the rich. None of those help the rich. I mean, those are all middle class, lower class tax cuts. The real debate about taxes is going to be whether and to what extent you end up extending the so-called Trump tax cuts at the end of 2025. That's what the real debate's going to be.
Right.
You know, you know, the truth is, government, in my opinion, has grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, undercut states' rights, and is not linking resources to results. And so I think, you know, we need more revenues as a percentage of GDP. We can get some through growth, but we're not going to get nearly enough through growth alone. We need to reform social insurance programs and address mandatory spending. And we need to reprioritize and reduce projected discretionary spending, including defense. And we really got to get control of interest. Interest is our second largest expense. It's going to be the largest expense in the federal budget within the next 5 years, and we get nothing for it. And yet, neither candidate is really addressing this.
Okay, so it's not really being addressed, but it is an issue where, you know, the debt's continuing to grow, and this is going to affect our economy long term.
Well, and you know, and we're not taking the BRICS seriously enough.
Right.
BRICS met in Russia earlier this month. They're expanding their membership. They're looking to create an alternative currency backed 40% by gold and 60% by a basket of other currencies. They, you know, and we're not taking that seriously enough.
Okay. Well, it's okay. I mean, this is interesting, and let's go a little bit now into the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, and talk about what do you think is going to happen here? What are you predicting? I'm hearing different things out there about the Senate, the Congress. Let's start with the Senate. What are the? I mean, I know Montana, John Tester. There's a couple of other races that seem to be close. Have you heard anything about?
I think the odds are very strong that the Republicans will take the Senate, but not by much. I looked this morning on the prediction analysis. What I saw was 90% likelihood the Republicans will take the Senate, although reasonable people will differ on how much. I think most people are saying they'll have at least 52 seats, which is not much of a majority. I also saw this morning that the prediction analysis was 53% Trump, 47% Harris, and 52% Republicans and 48% Democrats for the House. I think the Senate is the only thing that's pretty certain that the Republicans are going to take the Senate. I think the presidential race is a coin flip, and I think the House is a coin flip.
All right. So you still think that either as of now, you think that you know, Senate could go Republican. We don't know about the House. Maybe keeps Democrat. If you were a betting man right now, what you put a wager on it? You know, what odds do you give Harris to win? What odds do you give Trump to win?
Well, I'm not a betting man on it. Okay, the betting markets, okay, or the people who actually do bet. The latest numbers that I've seen are like 58-42, 58% Trump, 42% Harris. That there are betting systems, in some of which are international, some of which are in the United States, and what I've seen is like 58-42.
Okay, so I mean, still,
it's hard enough to earn your money. I don't like giving it away. I'm betting.
Yeah, I know. Well, a coin flip. It's still, you know. So, I guess we'll know. Do you think so as you said, probably won't know till the end of the week or even next week. Who's officially?
I think we'll know within days, not weeks. I don't think this is going to be, you know, a 2000 Bush v. Gore, you know, race. But I don't think we're necessarily going to know tomorrow night.
Now, in terms of I want to shift now in terms of just like one issue that I don't think for some reason has been not talked enough about, and I want to get your opinion about it. Is that we've talked a lot about the January 6th insurrection, and we've seen what happened that day. But what often is concerning is we don't talk about what happened after the insurrection, when the United States Congress put it to a vote to certify the elections in the U.S. Senate. 139 Republicans voted to not accept the results of the election, even though
all the court cases been dismissed.
Well, that was in the House.
What would have happened?
Yeah, that was in the House.
Yeah, but what would have happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, what would have happened though if Vice President Pence did not certify the results, and they basically overturned the election? Doesn't that set a bad precedent for our nation that we're not gonna accept the results, so that every single election, and that's what's bothering me, is that let's say Harris wins, then they're gonna come and go, well, we're gonna follow all these court things and we're gonna do the same thing. Doesn't that send a bad message to the world that the one thing we've got going for us is the peaceful transition of power, and the fact that we accept the results? And as former President Bush said, the one that you worked for, that becomes a banana republic. When you start,
Yeah.
I mean, what do you stand on this?
Well, several things here. First, what happened on January 6th was unacceptable. Okay. President Trump should have intervened a lot quicker than he did. He waited too long to intervene. But in addition to that, the Speaker of the House and the Mayor of Washington should have accepted the offer to have National Guard troops. They were given the opportunity to have National Guard troops in order to supplement the Capitol Police. That they should have done that. They didn't do that. So what happened on January 6th was unacceptable. We did ultimately have a peaceful transition of power. Vice President Pence followed the Constitution and certified. There were irregularities in the 2020 election, and there were some circumstances where people flat did not follow the law, including in Pennsylvania. However, in my opinion, there weren't enough irregularities to overturn the result. Trump lost and ultimately vacated the White House. And I think it's important that we do that we take steps to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And I think it's also important that we recognize that, a peaceful transfer of power is one of the things that differentiates us from other parts of the world. I will tell you that no matter what happens in the presidential election, tens of millions of Americans are not going to be happy, but that doesn't mean that it should result in, violence, anything like what happened in 2020.
Let's take a minute. I mean, in North Carolina, I'll tell you that we are going to probably have Josh Stein as our new governor against the Mark Robinson meltdown. We don't know what's going to happen with these other races, but I think that it is very evident that Trump is probably going to most likely win North Carolina, but still never say never. The last Democrat to win North Carolina in the last 20 years was President Obama. But let's talk a little bit about, we have 20 minutes left, but you've been a part of No Labels. I, in my lifetime, have never seen this country as divided as it is. Walk us through, in your opinion,
other than the Civil War, which wasn't our lifetime. So, yeah.
Let's talk for a second about having worked for two former U.S. presidents, Clinton and Bush too. How did we get to this point? How did we get to a point where there's 10 million Americans that are not going to accept the results either way? There is negative attacks that the likes that I've never seen going on social media, TV. What happened?
Well, I think
how did we get?
I think there are many reasons that we are where we are. Okay. First, we have too many people that are in elective office that are career politicians. They may or may not have had a real job before they get elected, but once they get the job, I'm talking about the federal level right now, they want to keep it for life. All right. Secondly, if you look at how the redistricting system has worked, it's been gerrymandered and designed to protect a particular political party. It varies by state, depending upon who controls the state legislature in those states. But redistricting has been designed to try to minimize competition consistent with the Voting Rights Act, rather than to maximize competition consistent with the Voting Rights Act. Our campaign finance laws need fundamental reform as well. Too many of our primaries are closed primaries, which means you've got to be a member of the political party in order to vote in the primary. There's typically very low turnout in primaries. The extremists in both parties tend to turn out disproportionately. Therefore, what happens is you get somebody who's not in the sensible center. Two people typically are not in the sensible center that end up being who you have to choose from in the general election. Now, about 50% of all voters are unaffiliated. The parties are losing market share. People are getting disgusted with regard to both parties and the status quo. We don't have term limits, which I think we should have. 12-year term limits would be a reasonable period of time, I believe. The media is part of the problem. The media is not fact-based. It does not provide equal time. Part of the media is slanted left, part of it slanted right. There's very few places you can go to get facts with contextual sophistication without being subject to political opinion. Social media is a big part of the problem. In addition to that, starting in the mid to late 1990s, members didn't bring their families to Washington anymore because they only meet 3 days a week. Okay. And so basically they kept their families back at home. They were actively discouraged from fraternizing with each other. And as a result, they treated each other like the enemy. The idea of having loyal opposition is not something that is in the current vernacular, no matter who's in charge. And so there's lots of reasons why we are where we are. But the bottom line is we need political reforms. I mean, we need redistricting reform. We need integrated and open primaries. We need campaign finance reform. We need term limits. We need ranked choice voting, I think, is something that needs to be given serious consideration as well. In order to revitalize our democracy and in order to restore a republic that is representative of and responsive to the general public, because that's not what we have right now. And in addition to that, we have too many people living for today rather than trying to create a better tomorrow. We've forgotten part of the Constitution that talks about for ourselves and our posterity. It's not just for today, it's for tomorrow. And we're not discharging our stewardship responsibility to our country, to our children, to our grandchildren, and to future generations. That's got to stop. Sorry for the long answer, but
no.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So I'm hearing a number of things from you: lack of term limits, the amount of money that's going into these elections, billions of dollars, only 14, maybe 16 billion. The next U.S. Senate race in North Carolina, they say, is going to cost about $800 million. Outside money coming in. And former President Clinton made a good point when he was speaking in Raleigh 2 weeks ago, the lack of shared information networks. That when he was governor and president, he would go to a diner and it would be a paper and people sitting at the coffee at the diner talking about issues. And then today when he goes there, he sees Fox News in one diner, he sees CNN in another. And so we're getting our information from other sources, but we're not necessarily having a dialogue. And so it's created a wedge within us that everything's driven by the media, false security of the polls. And now no one really knows, what's going on. So that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, that we've gotten divided.
Well, I think it's important that you get information from reliable sources. And I think it's important that when you're talking about the media, that you have multiple channels that you get information from. In my opinion, too many people in the media today are commentators. They're not journalists. They're commentators. We have too many what I call fact-free zones. They're full of opinion, but there are very few facts. And then when the facts are given, they're without intellectual sophistication.
Right.
Which means it's very misleading. And so, we are where we are, but those are some of the reasons I think that we're so divided.
Before we get to our final analysis of the elections, I mean, what do you think we have to do to get better on this? You've been a founder of No Labels. I mean, a third party? Is that unrealistic that would ever happen? Do you think it'll be the next generation that comes in?
No.
I mean,
Yeah, there are a lot of minor parties. I mean, I co-moderated a presidential debate between the Libertarian Party candidate, the Constitution Party candidate, and the Green Party candidate about 10 days ago in Hollywood. And unlike many of the major party debates, we conducted ourselves in a professional, objective, and nonpartisan manner. The debate was civil. The debate focused on the issues that the American people cared about. We got people to answer the questions that they were asked. So there are minor parties out there. Some people think we need a major third party. I don't know whether that'll happen or not. But what I do know is that the status quo is unacceptable, unsustainable, and we need some of the kinds of political reforms that you and I have been talking about on this show. Some of those things can be done at the state level. I mean, they don't require the federal government to do anything. There are some of those things that can be done by legislation. Some of the things would require a constitutional amendment. The one that would require a constitutional amendment is term limits. And I would argue you probably need a constitutional amendment for campaign finance, given the Supreme Court's decision. I mean, I'll give you a novel idea. The only people that can contribute to campaigns are people that can vote. Newsflash: unions can't vote, and corporations can't vote. Another one is, like, I used to live in Connecticut. They had limits on how much money that could come in from out of state. You couldn't get more than 20% of your money from out of state. Therefore, you got people who actually have skin in the game that are providing most of the financing. So there's lots of different ways you can come about this. But the situation we have right now, I think, needs reform.
yeah, I mean, I think it's we got 10 more minutes left, but I think it's incredible. I mean, maybe there will eventually be a viable third party. Maybe, do you believe if Trump wins again, that after walk me through what you think would happen in each what would be a second Trump presidency look like to you?
I think a second Trump presidency. Well, let's talk about some of the issues. I think on the border, he would take steps to try to secure the border on day one. I think with regard to international stability, he would be very aggressive in trying to achieve negotiated settlement for Ukraine. I think he would impose very tough sanctions on Iran to be able to cut off, to undercut their economy so that they couldn't end up funding terrorism in the Middle East and other parts of the world. I think he would try to take steps to control spending. I think he would try to right-size government. I think it's pretty clear. He's already said that Elon Musk has talked about a government efficiency commission to try to be able to right-size government. I think he'd take steps to try to do that. I think he'd try to deregulate, to do a lot more deregulation. I think he'd try to, and I'm not saying these things are good, but I'm just telling you what I think. Okay. I think he would try to extend most, but not all.
No, I'm just
cuts. Try to extend most, but not all of the tax cuts. He's talked about trying to take steps to encourage more manufacturing in the United States through the tax code and through targeted tariffs. I mean, those are just a few things off the top of my head, but I think rightly or wrongly, he's a lot more of a transformational change agent. Okay. I mean, he wants to do more dramatic things. Whether or not he'll be successful is a different story. Okay. And obviously, whether or not he's successful to a certain extent depends upon who controls the Senate and who controls the House and by what margin. Keep in mind one thing on fiscal issues, on things that deal with our finances, taxes, and spending. You can circumvent the filibuster through the budget reconciliation process. Budget reconciliation cannot be filibustered. And so therefore, to the extent that you want to do transformational type of things that help rather than hurt our finances, the way to get that done is through budget reconciliation.
budget reconciliation, working on those issues, and doing all these things. Now, in our closing minutes, what would a Harris presidency look like?
Well, I think Harris, she said herself that there would be some differences between her and Biden, but not big differences between her and Biden. Okay, I think Harris is naturally more progressive. I mean, I'm talking about as compared to Biden. I think she's naturally more progressive than Biden. I think it's less certain what it would look like because she hasn't been as specific about what she would do. She was asked, what are some things that you would do different from Biden? And she said, something to the effect that nothing comes to mind. I'm sure there would be differences, but there wouldn't be dramatic differences in my view. She's already said she would like to rescind most of the tax cuts that relate to Trump, except for people making less than $400,000 a year, which is consistent with what Biden has said. She's talked about some additional tax cuts that she wants to do that probably aren't politically feasible if you have divided government. Same thing for Trump, probably not politically feasible if you have divided government. I think it's more likely than not that we will, but we'll see.
Yeah, and I think it's just a matter of looking at the foreign policy would be a continuation of it. Do you believe that it's dangerous for Trump, if he doesn't accept the result of the election, if he loses, this whole notion of autocracy, that Putin is a good person, Kim Jong-il, is that just showmanship? There does seem to be a sense of fear of him, and that, just like when Reagan won the presidency, within 10 minutes or less than that, the hostages landed. Do you think there's some of that bully pulpit fear that he's trying to instill as the commander-in-chief of the United States?
I think that Trump is viewed as being more unpredictable by our adversaries. And you have to keep in mind that there were no new international conflicts when Trump was president. And I think part of the reason for that is I think, our adversaries wonder what the heck he would do, and that's one of the things and quite frankly, that's one of the things I'm most concerned about with Kamala Harris. She's totally unproven with regard to national security and foreign relations issues. And right now we've got a situation where Russia, China, North Korea, Iran clearly have an alliance against our economic, diplomatic, military, and cultural interests. They will be as aggressive as they can be. They have been during this administration. And to me, that's something that I think people have not focused enough attention on. That is a big issue, including whether and to what extent China might try to take Taiwan, either through a blockade and or an invasion.
But don't you think there's a greater chance of it happening if, we lose the war in Ukraine, that Putin would say, I'm just going to go right back in? But maybe
how do you define lose? I don't think there's going to be a lose. I think there may not be a winner. It depends on how you define lose, right? I mean, what do you mean by lose? Do I think Russia is going to take Ukraine? No. I don't. And I think ultimately there's going to be a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so that's probably, well, we've almost out of time. I want to thank David Walker for being with us today. I look forward to doing this show with you, David. It was a little harder than usual doing an hour, but it's a lot easier with you. And we want this to be a respectful conversation. We're going to be bringing in other guests after the election. We'll be running this show once a week. This was a live show. He and I are going to work on, during this pilot of the show, when would be a good time to do it. But we will be back after the election. And David, thank you so much. And my closing take is that, I look at our country today and I think of John F. Kennedy's inaugural, where he laid out a set of challenges to the American people, which really resonated with my father-in-law, who was an immigrant who lived in India, and he heard President Kennedy's challenge to the American people, and basically said that the faith and energy and devotion which we bring to this endeavor shall light this nation and all who serve it, and that light shall lead to a fire that will light up the entire world. And it was such a notion of, in America we could be united, we could do great things, and he challenged America. What can you do for your country? Not what can your country can do for you. And he also challenged the world. It's not what America can only do to you. It's what we can do for the freedom of man together. And I am with that notion because I hope that whoever wins the presidency will get us back to a place where they can challenge us to bring out the best in each of us, even if we don't agree on everything. I think that's what people want from America. There's nothing wrong with being a Democrat or Republican, sitting at the dinner table, talking about these issues, because we are the United States of America. I tend to be an optimist. I don't think it's the end of the world. Whatever happens, this nation will continue. But I think we, the American people, have to get better about how we have that conversation. And hopefully in American politics, we can bring in different perspectives. And that's what David and I, hopefully, David, you agree with me, we can work on this together to build these bridges with each other, which I think is so needed in media. So that's going to be one of the differentiators of the show. But David, thank you so much. We'll be getting back with you about bringing this back on maybe at the end of the week for a post-election debrief. And then, of course, starting in the end of the year and New Year, a new show, American Politics. But David, thank you so much for your time. Any final thoughts?
Stay calm. Stay calm and focus on the future.
We said, and a happy Diwali to all. If you are still practicing, it's the Festival of Lights, and let the light and love of our hearts always lift us out of the darkness. And we wish blessings to you and your family and people around the world still looking at America as the place to be. I hope we can keep that light of hope going for all over the world. Thank you so much. Be safe.